Well, thanks very much for joining us. My name is Anna Brown. I'm a senior lecturer in management at the business school here at the University of St Andrews. My research work is about craft. I've also in the past run a small pottery business, and I run a module for undergraduate students around creativity as an agent for change. So I'm really glad to be here and to be joined by Hannah and Sam and Vanessa. And maybe if I can pass over to you to introduce yourselves. Sam, do you want to start?
Okay, hi, I'm Sam Vettese. I'm a reader and designer at Edinburgh Napier University. I'm originally a jewellery designer, and when I came back to academia, I started doing research firstly with digital craft and also with sustainable materials. We designed some sustainable materials that could be used in digital craft. And since then it's sort of morphed into workshops that we do where people, through making, through personalisation and these kind of interactive classes that we do, they learn about the environment and how they feel about themselves within that environment and how much they care about it, rather than us doing sort of top-down lectures about the environment. That's about it in a nutshell.
Thanks, Sam.
I'm Hannah Ayre, and I've got quite a varied practice. My degree back in the day was in ceramics. These days I do a lot of work as a light artist, so I make large-scale installations and sculptures, which can be seen at light festivals and events. I think what ties a lot of my work together is I'm very interested in taking art out of formal settings such as galleries and museums and actually putting it out in public spaces. And a big part of my practice is delivering workshops. And for the last about 5 years, I've been delivering Activism workshops for teenagers and for adults. We've been using scrap materials to make little mini banners, which people either keep at home as a little souvenir and a reminder to themselves, or they send the work off into the wild, maybe for their community to find.
Nice, thanks. And Vanessa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi there. It feels really weird seeing myself on the screen. It's really huge. But thank you for finding a way of me joining you today. My name's Vanessa Marr. I'm an artist and an academic at the University of Brighton down on the south coast, right at the opposite end of the UK to you guys. I'm also founder of the Domestic Dusters Project. As a researcher, I'm practice-based and essentially use making as a means of coming to knowledge, which my Domestic Dusters Project forms part of, but I also use it in other contexts as well. And the domestic dusters are on display at the moment in the museum, which is brilliant. I've seen some pictures of them, so great to have them here. Them with you physically if I can't be. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Vanessa. We look forward to welcoming you to St Andrews later in March to do a little bit more work on dusters. So just to start our conversation, an easy question. What does craftivism mean to each of you? Hannah, do you want to start?
Basically, it's craft meets activism. So I think that phrase was coined by an American crafter, Vettese. She coined that phrase in 2003. But obviously, people, particularly women, have been using craft as a form of activism for a long, long, long time. So for me, sometimes it's great big collaborative projects. So, for example, trade unionists have been coming together for centuries to make big protest banners, and then right down to the individual work, which is usually what I'm involved with.
I think for me it's about fiercely caring about things, and with our work we try to inspire people naturally to change their behaviour towards things that are not good for the world. And with craft, with people getting together and making things, it is embedded, that care is embedded within the objects and the making and the process, rather than, like I was saying, as a lecturer, telling people how to change their behaviour, or looking at theories and giving people papers to read about how to change their behaviour. The craft is, especially when it's with sustainable materials or something that is very natural and related to the earth, it's a more of an embedded way to inspire people to change the world for the better.
Thanks. Vanessa, would you like to add? It's very strange looking at Vanessa behind me. Sorry, Vanessa.
That's all right. It's weird. You can see me, but I'm aware you can't. Yeah, I'm behind you. I think for me, it's twofold. I think on the one side, it's an opportunity to collaborate and work with other people with a common cause. And from a personal perspective, it means that I get to use a skill that I love to make a difference in my life and in other people's lives.
Great, thank you. It's really nice the way that you kind of all highlight that collaborative, skilled work that you're doing, but also the idea that there's care for self and environment within that too, which is really lovely. And for me, craftivism is sometimes about the everyday kind of acts that we can do in terms of how we can influence change or try and raise awareness about various different issues. And I suppose just thinking around that, what role do you think that craft would have in or could have or does have in addressing societal challenges? So if we think about some of the things we're facing around inequalities and climate crisis or two that come immediately to mind, what sort of role does craft play there? Let's start. Vanessa, do you want to go first?
I think it's a way. I think it comes back to collaboration. I think it's a way of bringing people together. One of the great things about craftivism is that it's accessible. You know, so many people, different people can get involved in it, and they can do it in a way that's accessible to them. You know, it can be a small thing, it can be a big thing, it can be a thing you fit around. You mentioned every day, you know, a thing that fits around your everyday life. But I think it's about coming together. I think the way things are in the world at the moment, we can feel easily quite isolated, you know, whether or not that's getting through everyday things or thinking about global issues, and you feel like, oh, how can I possibly make a difference? But craftivism's such a great way of pulling people together. So I think that's where its opportunities lay for me, for sure.
Well, I'm particularly interested in the materials that are used in craft, and I think there's something about learning from doing, where you slow down and you're actually touching the materials, and there's a real sort of tangibility to that. And also with craft, more so than other kinds of learning, you often have time to sort of reflect on your own personal interests, and that to come out in the things that you're making, rather than having to do something that somebody else tells you to do. So I think with that slightly more meditative state of doing and learning, I think you can see the issues for what they are. You're not. And then with like I say, my particular interest is in sustainability and the environment. Understanding the materials that you are using. Sometimes when we buy things in the shops, we are detached from where they came from or who made them. And when you have maybe collected the material yourself, you know where it's come from, you see how it handles. You just understand the issues in a more real way than that slightly kind of more separate way that you have with consumer objects, for example. So I think it's that connection with it. It connects you with the materials, with the earth, and also the way things are made connects you with other people more so than other ways of learning.
I could continue from your chat about my approach. I'm part of a collective of Scottish makers called Closing the Loop, and Sam's worked with them, some of our members before, and again we're very interested in materials and sharing our knowledge. So we're 20 makers from across Scotland, and we meet monthly online and we meet in person as much as we can. And how we're trying to change the world and influence things is by sharing our knowledge with each other, but then also we'll have exhibitions and share our knowledge with other makers and with the public, and hopefully provoke, conversations and hopefully change through the work that we're doing. So yeah, big believer in the ripple effect.
Vanessa's work.
Vanessa, come in.
Yeah, I was just going to come back on materials and that point that you made about learning from doing. And I completely agree with what you say about the way that the type of materials that you're working with. But I would also say, and obviously I'm talking about the duster here, that actually there are certain materials that I think have got a certain power. And one of the things I really noticed when I first started running the duster project, which at that point was a surprise, it wasn't something I imagined would come from it, but has actually turned into a core part of the research, is what happens when you are involved with a particular material that speaks of a particular thing, in the duster case, an object, and what happens when you then spend time thinking with that, and it is that time, you know, craft takes a lot of time and your mind wanders, and I think there's something that's really transformative about crafting and that process of doing. And I think, coming back to craftivism, I actually think the process of actively making something for a craftivist outcome is as important, if not more important sometimes, than what you actually end up with. I mean, they then have their own legacy and they go on to speak and they do whatever you want to do with them, you know, display them, send them to somebody, march with them, whatever that looks like. But that process of sitting and making it is actually where a lot of that personal magic happens. And I think that's where a lot of the empowerment happens, which then leads to the ripples that you were also mentioning.
I think it's a different way for innovation to happen. It's like a sort of a kinder, more connected way of doing things. So from your Closing the Loop group, it went on to be a project called, well, it didn't go on to be, but related to it was that project called Alter Matter, where they teamed up Scottish craftspeople with Indonesian either product designers or material designers, which went on to be this project that I've just been visiting in Indonesia, where they brought in a European material designer and an Indonesian product designer or materials designer, and a microfactory in Indonesia, like a sort of fair trade microfactory. And they were doing really innovative stuff with cow dung and with cement and all that sort of stuff. So that sharing and that time and that way, you weren't thinking, I'm sure, when you were doing, people were doing what they were doing, they weren't thinking about innovation or, you know, that it could go on and change, you know, factory life in Indonesia, but it just very naturally did change things for the better, you know, from that kindness and that sharing. And, you know, I know that the women in the Applied Arts College and that Closing the Loop, they're wonderful. You just want to be with them and everything feels better in the world. So, you know, I think, you know, that empowerment can happen, but also you don't think of innovation happening through, you know, knitting groups or whatever, but it really can happen that way too, I think.
I love that skills sharing across the globe there, and looking at what skills you have and how they could relate to a different material that's local to a different area. Certainly when I've done residencies with other makers who've got different practices, we'll bring along materials and objects, and suddenly somebody's using a material or a tool in a really different way. That's because they're not trained in that. Then they can bring something different to it and break the rules, and then something new can come out of it.
I think that's really nice. And you started talking there a little bit about how the things that you're making or the materials that you're using are a way to thinking or towards problem solving. Is that what you found in the projects that you've worked with and the people you've worked with?
Oh yeah, for me, absolutely. So the first thing I started working with was cellulose, which was a byproduct of a textile company that we wanted to see if we could 3D print with that. And then we went on to work with waste textiles from the Scottish textile industry, waste leather from the leather industry. Now we're on to ocean plastic. And then we're just doing a project with the Lost Shore Inland Surf Resort, where we're using surfboards and wetsuits and things like that. And there's different audiences that can think about with their particular hobby or their particular interest. They can think about the particular societal problems that the materials that they're involved with affect. And then the making and the interaction with it and the personalisation of the things that they're making, you know, it makes that learning even deeper and meaningful to them. So with all the different materials we've used, there's been a similar learning outcome, but learning about different aspects of the environment through that.
I think problem solving is just a huge part of what artists and makers do. Also, I've worked with a lot of scientists over the years and realised that actually we work really similar ways. It's all about solving problems, and I just get really frustrated with the decline of arts education in schools, because it's teaching problem solving skills, and the world has a lot of problems that need solving.
Interestingly, I'm not sure. When I was doing my PhD was in pottery making, and I always used to say to my tutors as supervisors, there's a lot of parallels here between what I'm doing in terms of knowledge making versus working with clay making. I think those kind of ring true. Vanessa, do you have insights on that from your work?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. Thinking with your hands, it's lost, isn't it, in so much of our education, and it's absolutely heartbreaking because that's how we think, a lot of us. And actually, I think if you think about how children learn, it feels like it's one of those things that perhaps we unlearn. And yeah, I think it's just about thinking with your hands. I think that's something we should all be doing, and it doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter if we're skilled or not. But it's a really transformative process. And I guess the thing with craftivism is that then gives it a purpose. And sometimes, you think, well, what do I make? What might I make? What would be the point in it? And craftivism can give it that point. But that thinking with your hands is absolutely crucial. And I really agree with you in terms of what's happening with education and how important is that happens. That's what's so exciting about you, Anna, in the business school, bringing craft into what you're doing with your students. I'm sure that must really empower them and get them thinking differently in whatever area they end up working in.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of our motivation for building a module around creative process rather than outcome was about the fact that creativity is one of those employability skills that people are looking for, and you come and you study business and management because you're going to work. I mean, everyone will work in an organisation of some sort, but you're going to be a manager or a leader. That's your aspiration. But if you're not given the space to understand that way of thinking and to understand those kind of skills that can hopefully think differently about complex problems which have endured for millennia or decades at least, they're not getting that opportunity to do that. So it's a sought after skill, but they're not taught it. So we wanted to open up a space for that within the curriculum, and it has been radical, but it has also been kind of warmly accepted, which has been great.
Do you think that assessment, the way that things are assessed, has anything to do with that kind of decline in craft being embedded within either art school or design schools or even at schools? I know going off to a tangent slightly, my son with his higher English, he was given an inspector calls, which I think is a beautiful story, and he just had to memorise quotes rather than think about, what it meant to him or something like that. And with craft, that moment where you've got it right or you understand, what you are doing, and that hand-to-eye coordination, and then when you have an idea and you can actually make that tangible, that just comes in its own time. And I know with our students, there's an assessment point at the end of 14 weeks or whenever, and you maybe haven't given themselves time to find that natural flow of skill or whatever. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, perhaps it removes some of the uncertainty around the kind of making process. Making an essay, it's still a process of making, yes, isn't it?
Yes.
But the uncertainty is kind of taken away or is minimised within that, and uncertainty or not knowing is quite a big part of the practicing that you're doing and the working with the materials that you're doing. Perhaps. Vanessa, come in.
Yeah, I was going to come in on that about in the point you were making about assessment and outcome. I mean, I teach practice-based students, and we want them to make mistakes and to explore and to learn to be comfortable in that not knowing space. But actually, because they're working to an assessment of something visual, they really feel the pressure to produce something that looks amazing. And I actually teach graphic design, not textiles. And so, you know, they can quite quickly use digital skills to make something look really slick, but it might not have that contextual underpinning. It might not have had that space spent in the not knowing stage that we know actually really enriches the outcome. And so it's a real challenge to provide a space for students where they can feel comfortable in that. And I wonder whether with your students, Anna, whether or not the fact they're business students, if they're less worried about that or more worried about that. And we are going slightly off at a tangent, but I also understand what you're saying about your son learning in spectacles. My daughter, I remember when she did her GCSEs, it was the same. There isn't that deep contextual understanding because there's a whole load of stuff to memorize to achieve a certain thing and then go charging forward. And craft is that slowing down thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I think you've really hit on it there, Vanessa, in terms of the making process being the slowing down and the meditative practice that allows you to think through problems in a more kind of comprehensive way. My students are worried about how we're going to assess their outcomes because they're not trained creatives, but we don't assess their outcomes, we assess their engagement in the process. So it's kind of a conceptual shift for them and for us. But just thinking back to kind of craftivism and that kind of slow kind of work that you do and the engagement with the material, the object, all of those things you've talked about, and thinking about that as a feminist kind of practice. Could you kind of comment a little bit on how either women that you've worked with or things that you've observed, how women have used these kind of traditionally kind of female or feminized techniques like stitching to subvert tradition and to make. And if you've got specific examples from the projects that you've worked on, I think that'd be nice to share.
A specific example I can think of, not one of my projects, but over in the States, is the Pussy Hat project. You're probably aware of when, what was it, the day after Trump's inauguration, the last time, thousands and thousands of women took to the streets wearing the pussy hats that they knitted and crocheted, and they were taking Trump's horrific remarks about grabbing women by their pussies and turning it into a little bit of a joke, a bit of a comment. So they were using the colour pink, traditionally seen as a very feminine, soft colour. So yeah, I thought that was very playful and also a really clever way of getting press, because it's really hard to get press to turn up to a protest and to publicise it. But when you've got all these women in these pink little cat ear hats, it's quite hard to ignore. I thought that was very clever.
Vanessa, do you want to respond on?
Yeah. I mean, right. Anna has discussed kick me if I talk about the dusters too much. But that is absolutely fundamentally what the point of the dusters is. It's about a feminist voice, and that's what absolutely underpins it, and that's inspired by so many different things that have happened before. Girls putting subversive things in samplers that we wouldn't consider subversive, but they were, back a couple of hundred years ago. The suffragist banners, which is very pertinent today, is International Women's Day. The fact that they were stitched, I think, is so important. You can just imagine them sitting collectively and making those. The Women's Postal Art event in the 1970s, they had some of this in the exhibition that was in London a couple of years ago, and it was brilliantly homemade and just full of personal voice and protest, really holding that feminist, this is not okay, I'm not happy with this, and I'm going to use craft as a way of holding that voice, because there is that legacy of women working with cloth, that legacy of women with stitch, and yes, men make and men have stitched, but it does sit in that context of women's work. So that's absolutely fundamentally what the Dusters project is all about. It goes in lots of different directions, but it always comes back to that feminist purpose.
I suppose a bit different, but my favourite version of feminism is like the Vandana Shiva eco-feminism type of thing. And there was and I'm going to talk about this Indonesian thing too much, like you with the Dusters, but there was one of the participants there, one of the Indonesian participants, and when she was doing a panel discussion like this, the first thing she said about herself was, I'm a housewife, And my friend Chloe whispered to me that she didn't really like this woman to begin with because she constantly had a baby under her arm that was constantly crying when she was doing her part of the project. And the thing that she made was in the village that she came from, which I suppose was kind of a peasant village, I can't think of the right way to, a very poor village. She had made these beautiful low energy lamps from cow dung bases and this paper that burned very well, and they worked with the people that had made bamboo buildings. And the paper that they used for the lamps was a byproduct of the tempeh and tofu that was being cooked in the village by these women. And what she talked about was how these women who had innovated with making the tempeh and the tofu just knew that they knew what they were doing. If it was one of the guys that I work with in the design department, you would never hear the end of this innovation and, oh my God, tempeh and tofu, you know, you would never hear the end of it. But these women, they had just always made this, and they always just knew. And they just wanted their village to be a healthy village, so they found a way to dispose of the acidic water and things like that. So there's something about the way that, and it's often invisible. I saw some of the dusters downstairs about women being invisible. The invisible way that these women just kept this village working and well, and the babies were all healthy. There's something about that invisible activism and just knowing rather than shouting about the methodology that we used and, you know, how innovative it is and things like that. I found that really inspiring, that the just knowing. And she called it domestic hacking, which I think is really lovely. I love guerrilla kindness as well, but she called what she was doing domestic hacking, which, you know, I was really inspired by that.
When you say just knowing, it's often it's learned and it's experimental and it's shared and it's passed on.
Yeah, I know, but they would never even think about shouting about that. They just did it and just solved the world, just solved it quietly.
There's a kind of modesty to it.
Oh, yeah,
absolutely. So thinking about the role of craft and creativity and activism, and thinking about the future for craftivism particularly, how do you see the role of craft and creativity evolving in contemporary activism?
This question gets me thinking about the state of protest in the UK these days, where we've got new laws, where we've got environmental activists who are currently imprisoned for sentences of, I think it was 5 years, just been reduced to 4 years, for peaceful protest and even for planning protests. So I think we're living in quite scary times, and I wonder whether craftivism can be a tool in the activist's toolkit, because it's got that, it's gentle women's work, then maybe it's not such a scary form of activism. I don't think they've passed any laws that prevent us from stitching so far. So yeah, I wonder whether it could be a useful tool going forward.
Yeah, I think we will sneak in and change things, and it'll happen naturally and organically. I know that we don't teach anything to do with craftivism or craft. Everything's become very theoretical in the design department, but I know that with Chloe and myself, we are approached by students all the time that are just sort of like, you like crochet? You know, it is that sort of, it's sort of like, I don't like these papers that we've been given to read, but can we just talk about like materials and craft and something like that? I really do think it's going to happen, and it's going to happen quietly. We will make the changes that we feel fierce about. For me, it's just going to happen without us shouting about it, because I know that the interest is there. I can feel it, and I can feel when it becomes subversive to be doing stuff like that within academia. You know that we've hit on something that is, pushing against the patriarchy. And I think it will just happen by itself.
So did you have your hand up?
I was going to say sneaking as well. I love that. You know, oh, it's just the women doing the things they always do. Oh, they're just knitting. It's just that thing old ladies do. And, you know, when they're not looking, that's when we can sneak in under the radar and make all these things happen. And suddenly there will be. So, yeah, I love that sneaking. And I love your use of the word fierce as well. You know, I think we can embroider and knit and crochet fiercely. I knit and crochet and embroider, and crochet is what I do when I'm feeling fierce because it has the right amount of energy in it. So yeah, absolutely, let's sneak under the radar when they're not looking.
It's like they're hiding in plain sight, isn't it?
Yes.
You're going about your business. And I think we talk to our students about creativity as an agent for change, for social change, rather than something that's going to bring you eminence or fame. It's something that you can do on a really everyday level. And we do talk to them about activism and craftivism and ask them to engage in those practices, but we're sort of asking them to do that activism again on an everyday level, on an accessible level, that's not something that's high and lofty that might end up in prison, but you know, unfortunately, but it's more so something that we can do through the kind of everyday acts, and an example that we use is seed swapping, and you know, just finding different ways to exist and be within what is otherwise a kind of society dominated by capitalist kind of ideologies and ways of thinking.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in, I don't know tons about it, but the idea of the gift economy, where you just you know, you just give without expecting that sort of monetary return for it, but it's kind of paid on. You know, and the difference that you can make with these things is, it's not that sort of tangible, that'll be £2.50 please, but it's just more making that change through gifts and kindness. And one of the things we do to get a response when we do some of these kind of pop-up things with our 3D printers is we give people little things, and I've seen that with Guerrilla Kindness too, where you leave little things around and you just measure the smiles you get and things like that, and I think that can make such a difference compared to the things that are more measurable, I think.
Right. So, given the kind of technological shifts that we're seeing in society, how do you think that craftivism can kind of maintain its activist impact in that? Vanessa, do you want to jump in first?
I think it's the tangibility. I don't think it's any coincidence that in lockdown, lots of people started to craft when they hadn't before, or they went back to crafting when they hadn't done it for a while, or just all of the different things that happened around there that were about crafting. I think it's the tangibility is something that in a more and more a digital world that we as humans have a need for. But I also think that the digital then has an opportunity and brings an opportunity with craft, because it's a way of sharing it. And so there are ways of making the digital work really well to make whatever you've made shareable and accessible across digital lines, you know, the internet or whatever that might look like. But I think it's the tangibility that is going to be the human need that we have in more of a digital age.
I think as we've seen the rise in screens, we've also seen the resurgence in crafts as well, you know, obviously not as steeply, but, you know, we've got people knitting and crocheting and embroidery. Like I also did a ceramics degree back in the 90s, and I could not have imagined there'd be a like prime time national TV show, which is a pottery competition. We've got the sewing bee, so I think that people are looking for, you know, something different from their screens.
Yeah, and a meaningful alternatives.
Yeah.
Antidote to some of that scrolling.
And Sam, have you been involved in some of those projects which have brought makers working with like augmented reality? I know there's been some projects in Scotland in that way.
Not so much. We do bits and pieces with the students where they create something by hand, and then they see what they can do using simple AI tools, and just to see the difference, and you know, the AI falls short and why it falls short, and it is usually that sort of the way that it's very, very literal, whereas, you know, the the designing and the creative process is much more subtle than that. You know, there could be a feeling that you can't get through AI. But I suppose the digital that I'm involved in, even though I don't quite understand how it works, are things like 3D printing and laser cutting and CNC routing, where we bring that to people and let them interact with it. You know, it's not full-on crafting, but there's certainly personalisation where somebody can, you know, choose their own colour, and then they have their own little individual thing that has been 3D printed. But coming from a craft background myself, and being, you know, it's the 1980s that I did my undergraduate degree, I still kind of treat 3D printing and laser cutting kind of like a craft. You know, I would never just leave it as a prototype. I would usually file it or polish it or do something with these little objects that we get, and certainly with some of the materials that we create. And then working with Applied Art Scotland, we kind of hack the technology so that it can become more like a craft. For example, Carol Sinclair, she created a 3D printable material with waste porcelain and the polymer, the biopolymer that we use for 3D printing. So we sometimes get shoved in with the kind of STEM kind of subjects because
STEM,
I'm sorry, it's usually STEM, but we sneak in with the A, you know, it's a sneaky thing. So we sometimes get put in with these kind of projects because there's technology involved in it, and then bring in, you know, the handmade personalisation and the interactivity kind of through the back door with the people that we're working with. So, for example, with this wetsuit project at the Lost Shore, we're going to set up a 3D printer, laser cut plastic components, but we're also going to get people beading with these little beads that we've made from wetsuits. So there's a little bit of the hand while the technology is in the background. So again, it's a kind of a sneaky way for us just to be doing traditional craft projects. And I've got much more into proper pure wool and actual wool from the wool industry through doing these technological projects where I've made a composite with wool and bioplastic. So we have used this digital technology, digital craft, probably to try and do more traditional craft and introduce more people to traditional crafting practices and craft thinking.
Yeah, I guess technology is just another tool, isn't it? You know, it doesn't have to be binary. Is it analog? Is it, you know, techie? You know, I'll use my iPad to design installations and sculptures, but then, you know, actually make them in the physical realm. But I'll use the iPad because it's a lot quicker.
It sounds like I like what you said, Sam, about that idea of the technological or the more advanced, innovative kind of ways of doing craft is actually a gateway back into the traditional, which is about the connection and the kind of human element of it. And Vanessa, I was thinking then when you were talking about the quilts that you made during COVID, and just thinking about how engaging in that sort of act of stitching built connection with people who were otherwise feeling quite disconnected. And you've got your hand up too. So. Have you got your hand up?
Oh yeah, sorry, it's slightly weird. I was going to come back to the augmented reality thing actually, because lots of my students will use that when we're working between analog and digital. There's a great app that's free called Artivive, and you can make something as long as it's flat, it will read it. And then often what my students will do is, for example, create an illustration, and then through the app it would then move. And that really sits with an underpinning question of what can one do that the other can't, and what can the other one do that the other can't. And then you can really just seesaw between the two. You know, digital has sound, digital can enable some sort of immediate interaction. Things can move. But with craft, you can touch it. With something visual, you know, you can move it can be in a space. And so actually when you're moving between those two things, I think that's where some really fantastic opportunities are open that embrace both the digital and the analog within a craft context.
Absolutely. So I'm going to move us on to our next kind of theme of conversation, and I think a big part of the Say No exhibition and also of the Dusters and Craftivist work is about amplifying marginalised voices. And I wondered if we could spend some time just thinking about how craftivism as this kind of social process enables kind of collective empowerment and expression. And again, feel free to draw on the experiences and projects that you've done and those things.
Shall I talk about some of the dusters that are on display?
Sure. Yeah.
So the dusters that are on display, there are some from the main project, which addresses sort of everyday discrimination, and then there are also two from two particular groups that I've worked with the project. So one was with women seeking asylum, and the other was with people who identify as unpaid carers, and both of those are identified as marginalised groups, so-called hard to reach. The organisations I'm working with would argue that they're not hard to reach. Actually, it's just that they're hidden, they're invisible, and that can sometimes make them perceived that way. But in both of those instances, it's been really humbling, actually, and a real privilege to work with groups that are otherwise quite invisible or otherwise pushed into the margins. And to enable them to have a voice. So with We Care, which is the unpaid carer collaboration that I did with an organisation called We Care, we invited carers to embroider their experiences, and then they were actually displayed at the Senedd for Wealth Parliament building at the end of 2023. We're just finishing off a podcast at the moment where we've been interviewing the carers, and them seeing their voices, these things that they made around everyday life, hidden away in their homes, often often incredibly isolated, but to then see them in that very public space, and to see those responded to by MPs, and then the public response that's been that's happened through that as well has been really transformative for them. Has been really empowering and has changed the minds of the people that have seen them in a different way as well. The MPs responded to them in a very different way to the way that they might have done had there been a march, but they couldn't have marched. They couldn't leave the house to march. And working with the women seeking asylum, they feel very vulnerable. They're not going to join a march. They're terrified to do something like that. But actually craftivism and now enable them to find their voice that way, making something, discovering that other people feel that way as well.
Have you got examples from work you've done?
I have. I mean, I don't think I can top that, going up to the Welsh Parliament. I did last year, I did a project with LGBT Youth Scotland, and that was I think what made that successful was the partnership working. So it was a project through the youth group and through the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh. So the gallery provided a safe space to deliver the workshop. They provided funding for me to come along and facilitate the workshop. And then often in my projects, they're not, there's never the funding enough for it to be a long-term project where you really get to know the participants and really build that trust. So the shortcut for that was that the participants had their youth workers who they've built up a great relationship with. So then it's not so scary if the youth workers are bringing you along to meet the artist. So yeah, that was a lovely project where everybody made their own textile square, which got put together on a huge big banner, and then that was exhibited at Summerhall through in Edinburgh. That was part of Scottish Mental Health and the Arts Festival last year. So it was a way of getting their voices out in an exhibition.
I don't think I've done certainly nothing that can top that. But we are trying to get a project up and running to do with women's groups, very interested in knitting circles and older women coming together. We were just talking about a report that a organisation called Knit for Peace had put together about how important these groups are for women, to make them feel, older women, to make them feel less lonely, for the physical health, for the calming down with knitting, and even donating makes the women in these groups feel better because they feel like they're really doing something. They've given knitted things to all their family, and everybody's head to toe knitted things, and now they want to do something else. So we tried to, we never got the funding for it, to work with women's collectives in India, and it's similar. There were underprivileged women in India would come together in these groups, but what they did, Anuthi was the one that we were talking to, and they actually not only train women to do things like block printing and weaving, but also to handle their own money, to start their own businesses. And there was something about that sisterhood and women coming together that we wanted to expand on and look at in a more academic way, just to see what we could take from this feeling of well-being that people were getting, and sort of tighten up the vocabulary and look at that more closely.
Do you think there's something about craftism in particular that kind of generates that kind of feeling of empowerment? Does it go back to, again, like the kind of materials and the slow process?
I think so. I think it is something about that that slightly more meditative state, that information enters and leaves in a different way.
Are the people that you're working with, do they identify as creative? I think that's quite an interesting part of do they come sort of fully thinking I'm a creative and I can do this, or is there some sort of coaching and encouragement into kind of engaging with those skills? I can see Vanessa's got her hand up.
I would say both. So sometimes people very definitely aren't, and they need coaxing and encouraging. There's a number of art teachers and sewing teachers, certainly from about 40 or 50 years ago, who I would like to have a strong word with. People who come along and say, I can't sew or I can't draw, because they were told by a teacher once that they couldn't do it because it wasn't perfect. So there are people like that for sure who need hand-holding and support and encouragement. And I'm very careful with the dusters to make sure that, running stitch and a word is as powerful as something that's, made by an embroiderer. But then inevitably, I think that there are people who are drawn to craft because they're crafters and they're looking for a project that they can get involved in. And then there are also those who are artists. But I think coming back to craftivism, one of the brilliant things about it is you can do it if you're an amateur. You can do it if you've never picked up a needle before, or not since your sewing teacher told you were rubbish, or whatever that looks like. That accessibility is really important. And so personally with the Duster project, there's a real mix, and I've made a point of making sure that continues to be the case.
We sometimes call it lo-fi prototyping that we do with people. It is kind of fail-proof. For example, you can make plastic materials by melting stuff on a panini maker. So we've got about 20 panini makers in our armoury. And some of the women from Applied Art Scotland were really interested in getting just the right panini maker that didn't have the edges for the...
So it's like a Ripple wheel, got a bit obsessed with panini makers.
and iron. And what we found with the young people that we were working with was that they thought they wanted to do something really personalised, but actually we had a few ready-made things, and those seemed to go quite quickly. So sometimes if somebody isn't super creative, if there's something in this lo-fi making where there's something that can be copied and they know that it's going to be successful for them, there's a kind of a support in that. It is like that, a pattern passed down from generations, and you feel like your gran is with you when you're doing it. If you've got something with the lo-fi making that you're going to get a good result from, even if you don't think you're that creative. And at that panel with that wonderful woman I was telling you about with the Tempe paper, she called herself an encourager. She would encourage the women in her village, and I really love that, being a facilitator or an encourager rather than a lecturer or professor or whatever. With that to bring out others, creative, because all ideas are great. And just, if you've had that teacher that's told you, that's worthless or whatever, some family member said something about you. But for us, this lo-fi making, having a few things that people can kind of copy, so that they start to feel more confident and see yourself as an encourager or a facilitator. That works well for us.
I think in recent years, I feel like I'm seeing a rise in perfectionism with children, which is really, really worrying. You'd agree? Yeah. I remember a couple of years ago doing a ceramics workshop for 8, 9-year-olds, and they should be that age where they're not worried yet, they're just playing. And very much the remit of the workshop was very experimental, but yeah, just kept having loads of kids just smooshing up their work and like starting again. In terms of my craftivism work, I try and make it really accessible for people that have never picked up a needle in their life. So I bring some tools. So I've got a die cutter, which if you think like an old-fashioned mangle or a printing press, and it's got these dies which are kind of like cookie cutters in the shape of the alphabet, so people can cut out lettering to put onto their banner. So people can make a beautiful banner with no sewing involved whatsoever, but then I will also bring along needles and threads and all sorts of bits and bobs for people who are more confident with their sewing, who want to learn to sew as well. So a bit of both going on there.
And how do you ensure that the kind of voices of the marginalised groups that you're representing or the communities that you're working with are authentically kind of represented and portrayed in activist work?
I think for me, some of my projects, there might be maybe my client or a funder has given us a particular theme. So I've done quite a lot of we're doing a pledge to the planet, so let's think about small lifestyle changes that we're going to commit to, and we're going to put it on a banner, either to take home and inspire ourselves or to put in a public place to inspire other people. So sometimes I might have a theme, but more frequently, such as a workshop I did here at the Wardlaw Museum a couple of weeks ago, it was very, very free, and participants could bring up any theme that was important to them. We had a woman who was making a tribute to a friend of hers who just died, so she was using her craftivism to explore her grief. We had somebody making a piece about refugees in her community. We had anti-war banners. We had environmental activism banners. So I think leaving the theme wide open for participants to express themselves.
Vanessa, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I think it's about giving, valuing their own voice, giving them autonomy, creating a space where they feel safe, and then having, a framework that's open enough that they can find their own voice, and then see that voice being valued and realise the value in their own voice through that. And that way there is no marginalisation, because nobody's being pushed to the side. Everyone is valued equally.
I think with Vanessa and I, we've both got a bit of structure within our workshops though as well. So there's a bit of a framework, so people aren't just completely clueless and not sure what to do. There's a little bit of guidance in as well.
You need a bit of something, don't you? Just enough, and it's a fine line. But you're quite right. I like the idea of your letter cutting out thing, by the way. I need to. That sounds fun.
You'd have a collab between the.
Absolutely. I want to hear more about your app you were talking about.
So thinking about that sort of inclusion and bringing people in and representing people from marginalised groups, and also about the kind of history of craftivism and techniques that you're using. How do you kind of ensure that inclusivity, but also avoid kind of cultural appropriation and extractivism in the work that you do? Or have you come across that kind of tension in the work that you're doing?
In terms of cultural appropriation, I feel like craftivism is my culture. I'm a woman. I was taught to sew and knit and crochet by the women in my life.
I think for me it's not so much cultural appropriation, but certainly when things are in our workshops that are about personalisation and making through doing, and thinking about the environment, it always seems to be from the heart rather than virtue signalling or greenwashing, which when we teach in that sort of lecture format about sustainability and the environment, it can be a little bit kind of top down, and the students will maybe just say what they think we want them to hear about things, or the complexity of looking after the environment just puts people off having a go at trying to do something. And when it is making, and when it is you know, about what you have maybe noticed as you were walking down the street with the bins being full of plastic, or what is floating in the sea at Portobello or whatever, it seems to be from the heart and related to your own personal circumstances, rather than it being, you know, like I say, you know, about virtue signalling, about saying the right thing, or about washing the issues.
Vanessa, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'd agree with Hannah, actually. I think, personally speaking, it does feel like my culture. Absolutely. And I think there is something about the heart of craftivism that's very authentic, that actually people find their culture within it, and then use that as a way of connecting with others, and sharing and trying to make change in that way. So, but I do think it's important from a facilitation point of view to make sure that you are listening to the cultures that are coming back to you. So, for example, when I worked with the asylum seekers, I started out being very open to the fact that it might not be the duster. You know, I showed them the duster, and they said what it meant, and then said, but actually we can use other cloths. You know, if there are other cloths that mean something to you, use those cloths. They actually all used the duster and they loved it. They said, oh yeah, we get it. That's fabulous. Let's go with it. But it was important at that point of joining to be open to the fact that it might be something else. So perhaps as a craftivist facilitator, it's about a state of mind when you go into it, and not so much, you know, what happens in terms of outcome, perhaps.
I think as a facilitator, you know, you have to learn very much to leave your ego at the door. You know, it's not about us.
Sounds very much like what you're asking of the people who are taking part, in terms of, you know, having a little bit of uncertainty within that process, and, you know, setting some parameters, but within that anything can happen. So that's really nice kind of.
One of my favourite projects was with a group of teenagers in Fife. We made 2 series of banners. The first series was all very, very important subjects that they were exploring, and they were putting them up in their local woodland park for their community to find. And then the second series of banners, I think they'd explored all the heavy issues, and so they went, right then, we're gonna make a series of nature-themed jokes for people to stumble across. I loved that contrast, a bit of lightheartedness.
Yeah. It's the guerrilla kindness again.
Exactly.
I think it sometimes takes with young people a while to sort of break down that thing when they're quite kind of worthy at the start, and that kind of sees, and you think that you're their teacher and you're going to be marking them in that kind of way, and then when they realise that they're actually having fun by accident, you know, that's when we started to notice that the things they were making related to their hobbies, and they would actually want to wear some of the things that they had made, which is, you know, a big deal for a teenager to actually show something that they'd made alongside the Nike or whatever it is young people wear. It's super expensive. But, yeah.
Sounds a little bit like they start to kind of relate with each other instead of just with the task, you know, sort of broken it down a little bit, and that joking is that kind of relational activity, isn't it, where you're kind of building, you know, together. I can see Vanessa again.
And having fun, you know, it's very easy to be very worthy, but actually making stuff's really fun, and it's great to get to the point where that's what you're doing. You're also making a difference. You're also accessing all of these different things and thinking with your hands and everything else. All of those things are happening, but actually it really is fun, and it's important to find that side in it at all. I do a project with my first year students where the first thing they have to do is to create a series of 6 gifts which are their personal manifesto, and that teaches them a whole load of kind of basic visual and digital skills. More recently, I've done it themed around the UN sustainability goals, and it's got a bit serious. But it started out saying they could write a manifesto about absolutely anything. And so we would have world hunger and the environment and, you know, all of these big issues. But we also had things like I had an Italian student who was really fed up with what the British did with his dishes, and his manifesto was all about, you know, spaghetti bolognese is not a dinner that is Italian, etc., etc. And there are all sorts of things that came through that. So, you know, there's a lot of fun to be had in protest as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Fun with purpose, you know. I think that you can't take the fun out of it. And I think if you're allowed to have fun whilst you're doing it, it opens you up to new and different ways of knowing and relating and being together. So certainly that's what I'm forever telling our students in the creativity module, that this isn't just about fun. It's not just about fun. But I think fun is inherently part of it, isn't it? So maybe talking about fun and relating to others, and can we spend a little bit of time talking about how craft can kind of build communities or foster a sense of community within participants?
Like I was saying, I'm really interested in the inherent well-being of these women groups and crochet groups and things like that. Also things like man sheds too, where we'd really like to do some serious research into, you know, anecdotally, people are feeling better, they're coming together as groups, they are helping their communities, they enjoy donation and just doing things for good. But maybe to look at that more seriously, because I know there's good things happening. And like I said, I was super inspired by that, the lady in Indonesia who was talking about that stuff that was happening in her village. But I know there is good stuff happening, and I would like to do some more real tangible research around what that well-being actually means. We went for another grant, and the man that was offering the grant said, "Oh, so how do you measure that well-being?" And I know with a PhD student that I've had that did kids clubs with 3D printing, she did little films with kids smiling, genuine smiles, and it needs to be something that's kind of real like that. About, you know, but otherwise, you know, somebody could sort of like put on like a toothy smile and say, "Yep, happy, feeling well right now." But you know, how to actually measure that in an authentic way to see the difference that it's actually making. That would be an interesting thing for us to do next.
I think my teenagers in Fife with their jokes, and I think that was a nice community project in that it was a project during their summer holidays, and we were physically in the parkland for a week making this work. And so, you know, other members of their community walking their dogs were walking past and asking us questions and getting to know what was happening. And I think, you know, teenagers in public spaces, you know, public spaces aren't made for teenagers, you know, they can be a bit noisy and people don't like it. And, you know, they were expressing themselves, they weren't graffitiing, they had permission to make these beautiful banners and leave them for their community to find. So that was, yeah, a lovely way of just helping them express themselves within their community.
And does it bring a kind of opportunity for people to discuss issues that maybe they aren't talking about? You know, if you're talking about in either your teenagers in Fife or the LGBT communities you're working with, or the marginalised women, are they finding opportunity to kind of make connection with each other and talk about things that have maybe been unvoiced so far? Vanessa, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I work with, there are lots of different communities, but I think I'll come back to the We Care because I've just been finishing the podcast off with them. And what I did with my community partner with that was that we had online workshops where they came and stitched their dusters. But what was really important to them, which they've all referenced in the conversations we've had, is about that coming together and immediately being understood. So you're in that space and everyone gets you. You know, if you're late, it was because they were caring. If they needed to dash out and come back, it was because they were caring. They were tired, this had happened, that had happened. Whatever they said, everyone immediately understood where they were. And there wasn't the need to explain or to worry. And that meant that immediately this group of people who didn't know each other actually became a community in a very, very short space of time, through a digital screen, actually, referring back to the previous thing. And I think it's that shared voice and that shared experience, and that kind of holds everyone together in that context. Coming back to what you were saying about impact, I have the same challenge. You know, you're applying for funding, and how will you evidence that impact is so challenging, because you know there are lots of little tiny ripples that happen in people's minds and bodies that then impact someone else and someone else, and there is no way of measuring that. All you can do really is to ask that please somebody write some statements so that I can use it in my report and get more funding to do the next thing. It's very, very hard to measure that, but I think it is just that coming together with that knowledge, that embedded, innate, invisible, not having to articulate it, knowledge that is shared, that comes through experience.
I think my favourite point in the workshops that I do with adults, when it's members of the public who don't know each other to begin with, I'll show them some craftivism examples to get them inspired, and I'll show them some tools and equipment, and there's a lot of me talking to begin with, and then it's the bit once they get making and they just relax into it, and then they all start chattering away. That's my favourite bit. Okay, I can just sit back now and let the magic happen.
It's nice, definitely. My students don't even let me tell them what they're supposed to do. They just launch in and get the stuff and off they go. Because it maybe seems immediately obvious what's to happen if there's a needle and a thread on the table and a piece of fabric to stitch. So yeah, absolutely. I think we're coming close to Vanessa, come in.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on that and say about that community when you're sitting around a table stitching, and it's something about not looking directly at someone, isn't it? That community that happens straight away. You're making, someone else is sitting next to you making, and the way that community can be created, sometimes for a very short amount of time. You know, the length of a workshop, the length of a series of workshops. It can be for 10 minutes. It can be something that lasts, years. But actually that comes from that sitting alongside somebody. And there is that kind of community of making that I think is really important in that space too.
Yeah, I think that's us for time for the panel conversation. If there's any questions in the room, please go ahead.
I have not a question, but a comment. I'm from Canada, and a good friend of mine in Alberta is a textile artist. Her name is Sandra Sawadsky. She may or may not be listening from Canada actually at this time. She's just spent 9 years embroidering a 60-meter long tapestry called the Black Gold Tapestry, which is inspired by the Bayeux Tapestry. And she's telling the history of black gold, which is oil, and Alberta is the heart of Canada's oil industry. So she goes, from Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it winds around museum walls, and you just see the history of humanity, of human civilization, and the Scottish inventors of the steam engine, and etc. And then you end up, with the very last panel is the renewable energy. So it took her 9 years. It's fabulous. You can look it up on the internet, Black Gold Tapestry. It is remarkable. I think some of your students would like to know about it. And it was just a very radical act, because she's talking about, she comes from the oil producing capital of Canada, but she's showing the good, the bad, the ugly of oil. She's telling a historical story, but making Canadians, question. So what I didn't get from today's conversation, I love how you used the word embedded. I heard the word tangible, and the collaboration amongst the makers, thinking with your hands. But what I didn't hear is how that magic, I think that was your word, how do we transfer that to the public who come to see the works? How do we get them involved? I mean, my big thing is climate change. How do we use art, and I'm a photographer, how do we use art to communicate? not just amongst you, the makers, but in the broader, and really looking for answers there.
So I mentioned briefly the Pledges to the Planet banners, so that's putting it in public spaces, but I think there's too much emphasis on that the public need to fix it, or if only you recycled a bit more, and if you ate a bit more vegetarian occasionally. So I'm a big fan of the projects where it's getting the people with the power involved. Okay. So I took part myself as a participant in a project called Canary Craftivism a few years ago, and that was one of Sarah Corbett, who runs the Craftivist Collective. It was one of her projects, really well thought out, beautiful campaign where she encouraged people to make a little textile canary and then send it off to your MP. And because, you know, it takes a few seconds to click and sign an online petition, but to spend time making a beautiful canary, writing a lovely letter, and the idea of the canary is it's like the early warning system of coal miners, so that was the symbolism for it. And that was a community of people up and down the UK who sort of came together to make these canaries, either sort of virtually, or some of us were encouraged to meet up in our areas. But yeah, I know that my MP, she got probably about 10 canaries sent to her in the post, a little flock of them. So, you know, I think that has a bit more impact, actually. So, and you know, and she was great and sent us all, you know, emailed us back, and it was, you know, really well thought out responses to us.
For me, that story could have been told lots of different ways. You know, it could have been like a series of photographs or a painting or something like that. But there's something about it being like in fabric and stitched that whoever looks at it, you know, that thing about the sneaking. It's like, oh, here's a nice tapestry, but there's actually something very powerful being said. So we don't know. We don't know the impact that has had on somebody that's actually, you know, because it's not super tangible, something could have really changed that you can't immediately see just from that. You know, the story is there, but it's in this kind of softer, feminine form than just, you know, with a spike sticking out and, you know, somebody whipping you or something like that, and then charging you, you know, punishing you that way. That it's not about punishment. It's a kind of a softer way to get into somebody's brain to encourage change, willingness to change. That's what we talk about quite a lot.
But I think that softer approach is because we're such a heady species, and everything is like facts, statistics. But there's something profound and radical about it. Hearing the story told differently. Yeah.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I think you make a good point about us not just talking to ourselves and as not just showing craft to other craft people. I mean, talking from the Dusters' perspective, it's really important to me that the Dusters, and they are in lots of different spaces. You know, they're in arts places and craft spaces, but they're also in schools, they're in conferences, they're in, you know, the place down the road, wherever they will pop up actually. And with the We Care work, where they were displayed at the Senate, you know, those went directly to MPs. They were then discussed in Parliament in a debate the following week, and there've been all sorts of tangible impacts from that. And then now what I'm doing with the community partner through the podcasts is we also, alongside that, have a publication that's going to MPs. So MPs will receive a publication which reflects on the Dusters. It's got pictures of them. It's got speeches from the day, it's got stories, really important, those stories that come from those participants. And the podcast runs up until National Carers Week in June, at which point the MPs will receive that, and they can then go back, hopefully, and listen to some of those voices and some of those stories. And we hope that the impact that something that was crafted and presented to them in an unusual space will then go on and have broader impact. But I love the Blackwall tapestry. I'm going to look that up. My oldest daughter lives in Canada, so I'm always got my ears out for Canadian things. It sounds absolutely beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
If you get a chance to see it, it's a must. It's overwhelming.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
I'm curious. So you've all mentioned issues with like funding and sort of
using craft in universities and in those settings. What impact do you think that institutionalisation of art has had on craftivism and activism? I know that's a loaded question.
Well, Vanessa's put her hand up, so that gives you some thinking.
I think it does sit in an academic context, and obviously, you know, that's where several of us are from, and so that's perhaps our route to funding in order to take it out there. But actually, I don't think that's necessarily where craftivism sits. I think craftivism sits in the community. I think it's a public, everyday thing. So actually, when we're coming from, well, I can only speak for myself, but coming from an academic perspective, actually, I see that type of academic funding, because that's what I can access, because I work full time as an academic, actually a way of taking that out into the community. So yes, things do sit in an art space and an academic space, and that's somewhere perhaps where, certainly in an art space, they perhaps feel comfortable. In an academic space, not always. You know, oh gosh, here she comes with her dusters again. You know, you get that, you do get that feeling. You find spaces where you're welcome, but it's really important to go into spaces where you're not as well. But actually, I think craftivism does belong in the community. That's absolutely where it should be, and that's where I think it belongs.
Yeah, I'm certainly, I feel like whenever I mention any of these things, I'm kind of up against it in quite a male environment at Napier, where they kind of push a kind of theoretical, they talk about speculative design rather than, you know, craft, I think, is the opposite of speculative design. It's about, you know, tangible and real and having a go at dealing with things. So I'm basically, because of this frustration that I have, I'm basically going to take staged retirement so that I'm half-time at my, you know, my university job, and I can kind of see it as a case study for things, and then do more work in the community and more time to actually do that as a proper thing. And if there's funding for that, and it's different from university funding, I've been quite lucky with funding in the past, but things are getting harder and harder, and I don't feel like, I don't know how you feel about it, I don't feel like sort of craftivist way of looking at things, and my kind of eco-feminism thing is particularly popular just now as far as funding is concerned. It seems that there's something else that's being looked for that is not the voice that I'm speaking with. So that is my plan. You know, I've been in academia forever, and just to keep it separate. That's my plan.
Do you feel like you've seen the fashions of funding change
Yes,
over the years?
for sure.
What's on trend?
Absolutely, I've seen it all. You know, for sure. Yeah. It could be different, you know. I do feel like like I'm saying, the sort of speculative, theoretical approach seems to be what's getting more sort of attention at the moment. There's not much funding going around at all. You know, everybody broke. But yeah, that's how I'm finding it.
I think I'm lucky then, actually, at Brighton, because we are kind of, I mean, in Brighton there's two, there's Sussex and there's Brighton, and Sussex is the, you know, the Russell Group University, and Brighton is the post-92. But the great thing about being in a post-92 university is we're known for the doing, and so actually there are internal funding things. They're not very much money, you know, it's £5,000, and you're literally doing it on a shoestring, but that will actively support community partnerships that are active. We have something called the Ignite programme, which is funded by AHRC actually, which is how I've done the work with the dusters, and that is actively encouraging you to go out and do these things that are change making, that are radical, that are innovative, that are messy and craft based, and you know you have to say what the outcome will be, but they understand that you're also working that out at the same time. So I think I'm actually quite lucky in that space.
I mean, we can still get little bits and pieces like that. We, the sort of community work we do comes under the banner of public engagement for us, and we do get bits and pieces of money for that. And because I do the stuff with the sustainable materials and innovation, we do these innovation voucher things. So I have one working with wool coming up quite soon. But the bigger funding, you know, the AHRCs and, you know, these kind of things, personally, I'm not finding I'm speaking what they want to hear. I'm not saying what they want to hear. at the moment.
It's very tough.
Yeah.
It's very tough. I agree. It is really tough. There seems to be more around health and well-being. That's kind of where I'm looking at the moment. Is that what's being funded? What might that look like? But it's really tough. It really is. I agree. And it's a shame because you know, we know what a difference it can make. And we're measured, unfortunately, by patriarchal measuring tools.
I'm also just too grumpy and old now. I basically just want to do my own thing without them, you know, without some kind of, you know.
Anyway. Just want to make. We just want to make.
How does that translate into the art world, Hannah?
My goodness, what am I thinking? There's a whirl of thoughts going around doing that. Back to those teachers that tell you you're not any good at art. There's I don't know, I can call myself an artist because I went to art school, and I think craft maybe is an easier, gentler way for people that don't have those creative experiences to get involved. You know, there's a whole load of amazing women on YouTube, and on TikTok is my favourite one for learning something if I'm ever stuck with a sewing stitch. You know, it's really accessible to learn things these days. And I think, like, even just learning how to fix a hole in your clothes or sew on a button, you know, this is an act of defiance against capitalism, you know. You can all get involved in tiny little ways.
Time for one more question if anyone else has anything to raise. If not, there's anything online. No. Great, thank you. Oh, one more bit.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you for all the work that you're doing, and even if it's not appreciated, I think it's really powerful. So I just want to say thank you. And also, there's a whole database or archive online of conflict textiles that are based out of Northern Ireland by Vettese. I was part of the group that brought threads here a couple of years ago, so just in terms of digital archives and availability, I think it speaks really well to the panel, and it's really good. It's phenomenal what they've done, so just to kind of maybe advertise that. But yeah, just to say thanks for everything, and funding is really difficult, but there's always little ways around it, which I think is the cool thing of this panel, is there's still quite a lot of hope, even if things are quite difficult, and we just have to find our own way. So yeah, just to say a massive thank you for everyone involved.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing it. I didn't quite catch it. Was what textiles?
Conflict textiles.
Conflict textiles.
Yeah, that's just the name if you type it in, and they've got a whole digital archive online, and maybe some of your work could be part of it, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if that's us, I'll say thank you to Vanessa online, and thank you to the rest of the panel as well.